There have been many attempts and movements in the US's history of places trying to become the nation's 51st state. There was the proposed state of Jefferson, that would have been made up of parts of California and Oregon, the proposed state of Superior, which would have been made up of parts of northern Michigan and Wisconsin, but there's perhaps none that have stood the test of time, like the proposed secession of Long Island, New York, which has had proposals for secession from the rest of the state since 1896. But why? Why do Long Islanders feel the need to secede? Are they really that different from the rest of the state? And do they have a real case to be made? Well, I certainly think so. And by the end of this video, I think you will too. If you didn't know, Long Island is here, jutting out from the southernmost portion of the state. It's not a city, although there is one on Long Island called Long Island City, which is actually in Queens, one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, but is technically located on Long Island. Look, the geography of this area is weird, and how it's all split up is even weirder. But the fact of the matter is, Long Islanders are very different from those living in the city and upstate New York. Why? Well, because Long Island is pretty isolated, all things considered. They have their own identity, which comes in many forms. One is that they have their own sports team, the New York Islanders, which is one of the only professional sports teams not to be named after a city or a state, but an entire geographical island. An island that spans over 118 miles in length and encompasses 8 million people. Yeah, you heard that right. 40% of the population of the state of New York live on Long Island. But there are a few caveats, one of which is how technically Brooklyn and Queens are included in that figure, as those New York City boroughs are geographically located on the island. However, Long Island's identity is separated from nearby New York City due to a few factors. First, Long Island is just not as hustle and bustle as the Big Apple. As you get further and further out from the city, the land really opens up from New York City suburbs to a somewhat rural landscape, and finally full-on farmland as you get to the area here near Riverhead, where the island splits off into two, what are known as the North Fork and the South Fork. All of this is to say that life is a lot slower here, and instead of being a massive city with 8 million people in it, it's a massive island that spreads its population out through many cities. Another thing that contributes to Long Island's unique identity is the Long Island Railroad, otherwise known as the LIRR. With lines stretching from Manhattan to the eastern tip of Suffolk County on Long Island, the LIRR currently operates as the busiest commuter railroad in North America. It's also one of the world's few commuter systems that runs 24/7 year-round. In 2023, the system had a ridership of over 75 million riders, or about 254,000 per weekday. That's kind of amazing, as there's nothing else like it in the entire country. Not many people think of Long Island when you ask them about what area of the country is interlinked with the most rail, but yeah, it's all right here. And complete with stops through rather small affluent waterfront communities such as Oyster Bay and Port Washington, to industrial middle-class cities such as Hicksville and Farmingdale, all the way to the Hamptons and farmland, and back funneling everybody into Penn Station and Manhattan. The Long Island Railroad is crucial to Long Island's economic success, and when we're talking about whether or not Long Island deserves statehood, I think this is a big crux of the argument. While the various cities that make up Long Island definitely have their own economy, I would be lying if I said many Long Islanders didn't use the LIRR to commute to their jobs inside New York City on a weekly basis. This is really why the ridership is so high. Coming from personal experience, as I've lived on Long Island before, these trains are packed to the brim every day, and if you're not sitting, you're standing, packed in like sardines on any given weekday. Much of the money on Long Island is made in New York City, and if something were to happen where New York City no longer wants to service Long Island after a hypothetical succession, well, what would that mean? Even if the island were to become the 51st state, anything happening to the LIRR likely wouldn't be a major thing to worry about. And while much of Long Island's money comes from New York City, those businesses there heavily rely on that hard-working workforce on the island as well. It's a symbiotic relationship. And like I said, on its own, Long Island has historically had a fairly strong economy. If it were to become its own state, its GDP would rank 32nd, just behind Iowa and ahead of Nevada, with a GDP of around $246 billion. And this is not including Brooklyn or Queens, which, as discussed earlier, are geographically a part of Long Island, but are boroughs of New York City. If Long Island somehow annexed Brooklyn and Queens into it, its GDP would be ranked in the top 20. But without the boroughs, the 51st state of Long Island would have a higher GDP than a few other New England states in their current form, including New Hampshire, Delaware, Maine, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Now, all of this is to say that if Long Island were to become its own state, it certainly has the capacity to hold its own. Long Island's economic prosperity, no doubt, comes from its economic diversity. Northrop Grumman, the American American multinational aerospace and defense technology company, is headquartered in the city of Bethpage on Long Island. And with 95,000 employees worldwide, its annual revenue of over $30 billion, being one of the world's largest military technology providers, and being ranked 101 on the Fortune 500 list of 2022, it certainly cements the island as being at the forefront of the national defense and aviation industries. Long Island is the home of one major newspaper and several smaller newspapers and radio stations. Newsday has one of the largest circulations of all U.S. daily newspapers. Since its founding in 1960, Newsday has won 19 Pulitzer Prizes and has been a finalist for 20 more. Tourism in the area is primarily focused on the summer season on Fire Island and the East End, with visitors attracted by the natural environment, parks, and beaches on Long Island. The North Fork on the east end of Suffolk County is known for its fishing villages, tourist towns, ferries to Connecticut and its neighbors, and for the area's wineries. The South Fork has similar tourist attractions, including golf, equestrian, surfing, and the fine dining in the Hamptons and Montauk. The island is also rich in farming history and features many produce farms all throughout. East End farms and farmers markets are the major provider of Long Island's locally grown fruits, berries, vegetables, poultry, and dairy products. Some farms offer pick-your-own peaches, apples, and pumpkins depending on the season, and this has become a traditional spring, summer, and fall outing for many of Long Island's residents. In a little over a quarter of a century, the Long Island wine industry has grown from one vineyard to 3,000 acres of vines in 30 wineries. The island's maritime climate, geography, and soil characteristics provide good wine growing conditions. The diversity of Long Island's economy is perfectly captured in this chart here. As you can see, the spread is quite even across the board, a sign of a great economy, which is, of course, great for making a case for statehood. But we haven't yet asked the question, do Long Islanders even want their home to become the 51st state? Well, official documented mentions of Long Island's secession range from 1896 to the present day, with the first known proposal of Long Island as its own state being published in the New York Times in 1896. Sugar refiner Adolph Mollenhauer claimed other big cities in New York did not take Long Island into account when making decisions and were spending money without any benefit to Long Island's interests. In 1996, a non-binding vote took place in which the idea of secession was approved. However, no further action was taken at that time. On March 28, 2008, Suffolk County Comptroller Joseph Sawicki proposed a plan that would make Long Island the 51st state of the United States of America. Sawicki said that all Long Island taxpayers' money would stay on Long Island rather than the funds being dispersed all over the entire state of New York. And in late 2022, Long Island Assemblyman Keith Brown proposed seceding to the New York State Assembly on the basis that Long Island is an ATM machine for New York City, believing that the island has enough money and local services to be its own independent state. On the contrary, the state stated their concerns with the proposal, calling the idea insane, believing the island as an independent state would not provide essential services and would marginalize minority communities living on the island. As of August 2023, no such bill has been put forward. Now, supporters see secession not only as a major way to save money, but also as a way to keep Long Island unique, and to refrain from the unwanted changes being made by New York State. The non-supporters do not agree with the logistics behind creating a separate state and do not think that the state and the government would agree to it, which doesn't exactly sound like a no to me. Culturally, Long Island likes to think of itself as being very different from New York City, most evident in their sports rivalries, but also in the amount of pride Long Islanders have from being in their own place. They pride themselves on the talent that comes from the island. They pride themselves on the food and the culture and the slower way of life. Think of living on Long Island as living in one small town, even though that's very much not the case. It certainly feels that way when you're there. Everyone on Long Island considers each other neighbors. And if you ever catch yourself outside of Long Island running into another person from Long Island, well, you probably just made a new best friend. And that's just not the case with New York City, or really anywhere else, to the extent that it is with Long Islanders. Long Islanders pride themselves on their unique identity, separated from the Big Apple, and I think cultural differences can be a big factor when considering secession and independent statehood, because cultural differences lead to political shifts, economic disparities, and really separate value sets. Long Islanders definitely don't value the same things that Manhattanites do, for the most part, and that's really the place where most of these documented plans come from, a place of different values. So, will Long Island ever become the 51st state of the United States? Well, there's really no telling right now. If Long Island both economically and politically continues to trend further and further away from the rest of the state, maybe one day we may see it become its own state. It takes a lot for a new state to form, but it's not like states haven't been added somewhat recently in the country's history. As recently as 1959, we saw both Hawaii and Alaska granted statehood. Maybe you were even alive then. But if not you, certainly your parents, or maybe even your grandparents for my younger viewers. members. 1959 was not that long ago, and we got 2 in the same year. Granted, those states hadn't split off from other states, but that's happened too. In 1861, as the US itself became massively divided over slavery, leading to the American Civil War, the western regions of Virginia split with the eastern portion politically. The two were never reconciled as a single state again, and thus the state of West Virginia was born. The idea of a 51st state is at the same time exciting and worrisome. If Long Island truly believes it would be better off as its own state, I think it should have the right to secede, for the benefit of the people. But hopefully, it doesn't take a civil war for that to happen. I'll see you next week on Town, City, State.